like Edgar Mitchell's experiences of inner and outer. Some of us enjoy munching on little nibbles, sipping drinks for our biological experiences, but we're also attuned to the spiritual, to the information, to the noetic dimensions of human experience. Lance Straight is professor of communications and media ecology at Fordham University. Media ecology, it pervades our experience and our inhabited area of living here in New York City. My goodness. All the publishing, all the television, all the dance, the opera, all kinds of communication, television, communication of all sorts are studied in media ecology. He was president of the Media Ecology Association for several years. He was also the executive director of the Institute of General Semantics for several years. General semantics, the study of meanings conveyed by language, symbols, signs, words, body language. And the founder of General Semantics, Alfred Korzybski, suggested that the unique characteristic of man, rather than animals, is time binding. Human beings, with their signs and symbols, can go back in time and forward into the future, so that tonight Lance will be talking to us about spirituality at the speed of light, because our technology has so advanced us that we can communicate on the internet. And the ways of communicating, the name Twitter doesn't mean much to me, but all these other kinds of communication and blogs that Lance has on the internet. Pardon?
It's Greek to me.
Greek to you. Well, and some of us. But Lance has produced a book on the binding biases of time. Meaning to me, we'll find out what it means to Lance after we hear him and study his book, which is available at the end of his lecture over here on the corner table. The binding biases. What ways are we restricted or restrict ourselves in using our human capabilities of exchanging ideas about spirituality and our biological abilities that sometimes bind us in the sense of biological constraints on our spirit, but also the psychological constraints on our biology. So tonight, Lance will be talking to us about the ways that we can communicate spirituality at the speed of light. Let's start.
Well, this is a talk I did prepare for tonight, so it's a bit different from what's in the book. But first, let me start by saying thank you to Anne-Marie Colvin and Alan Flagg for inviting me to come speak with you tonight, and thank you as well to all of Phi-Ons for your warm welcome. And I thought I might begin by revealing to you the secret. That is, the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. But of course, if I did that, you'd have no way of knowing whether my answer was the right answer. And even if it was, chances are you wouldn't believe me. Or you might say that the answer is different for every individual, or at least that we all have to find the answer on our own, that it's the journey that counts and not the destination. And anyway, if I just told you the secret, my talk would be over before it started, and you'd be wondering why you bothered to invite me here to speak to you in the first place, when I could have just given you the answer through a text message or a status update on Facebook or Twitter. Of course, all that is assuming that I do have the answer in the first place and that I'd be willing to share it with you if I did. So it's perhaps for the best that I forego talking about answers tonight and instead focus on questions. After all, answers may come and go as our knowledge expands and errors are eliminated, but good questions remain with us for all time. Everyone comes into this world asking basic questions like, who am I? Where did I come from? What am I doing here? And what is the meaning of it all? Throughout our lives, we're engaged in an attempt to answer these existential riddles, and our questions become our quest, our hero's journey, the great adventure that is our lives. So questions are the answer, but of course that's hard for us to see. And in addressing the topic of spirituality, I'd like to begin by suggesting that spirituality is not about something we have, something that we obtain, possess, and control. It's about what's missing, about something that we sense is missing from our lives, from the lives of others, from our surroundings, from our awareness and understanding. It's about what we're searching for, what we're longing for, what we don't have but need to find. It's a sense that there's more to life, the universe, and everything than we know, more than we can ever know. Alfred Korzybski spoke of non-allness, by which he meant that we cannot know all there is to know. We cannot say all there is to say, and at some point words fail us. At some point words are not adequate to the task and can be downright misleading. Or as Korzybski was known to remark, whatever you say a thing is, it isn't. Words cannot capture all that is out there in the world, and that prompted Ludwig Wittgenstein to remark, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. And he was quite right in that silence opens the doors of perception. Silence allows us to use our senses fully without having language short-circuit our perceptions. But our senses have limitations as well. We can't perceive all that's out there in the world. We're limited by the biology of our sensory organs, by our position in time and space, by a multitude of other factors. Even if we could draw on some kind of sixth sense or extrasensory perception, still we cannot fully know or understand ourselves, let alone know and understand the universe. If we were somehow to gain full knowledge of ourselves and our environment, we'd no longer be human. To be human is to be incomplete, to make mistakes, to be conscious of our own inadequacies as we are conscious of our own mortality. As human beings, we exist somewhere in between complete knowledge and complete ignorance, somewhere in between the sacred and the profane, somewhere in between the questions that we pose and the answers that we seek. We exist in between. We exist in the in-between, in the interstices and intervals, the cracks and gaps and crevices, in the interzone, on the threshold, in the liminal moment. Consider the fact that when we speak of the spiritual, we typically locate it in one of two places. We may locate it outside of ourselves, in our environment, our world, our universe, in natural and supernatural realms. Or we situate the spiritual inside of ourselves, deep within the core of our being, in our soul, our spirit, or in the spark of the divine or the fractured light of creation that we carry within us. But if the spiritual resides outside of us and inside of us both, where does that leave us? By us, I mean the us of everyday life, the us of the profane world, the us that remains. Clearly, we are in between the spiritual world outside of us and the spiritual core within us. We are the membrane between these outer and inner worlds. We are the medium, to use a term that is near and dear to my heart. And to quote Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. We are the medium. We mediate between the inner and outer worlds, between what is above and what lies below, between the divine and the earthly, between the celestial and the terrestrial, between the creator and creation. As a medium, we're in this world for perception, to listen and observe and try to understand all that we can. As a medium, we're in this world for communication, to express and to articulate, to give form to thoughts and to share discoveries, to bind ourselves together in common cause, and to commune with each other and with all that is. And as a medium, we're in this world for action, action that goes beyond. According to the Kabbalah, creation is an unfinished business. The universe is incomplete, and worse, our world is broken, and we're called upon to repair creation and heal the world. My topic is not just spirituality, however, but spirituality at the speed of light. And the speed of light is, as far as we know, the fastest rate at which anything can travel. It's the speed limit of the universe, clocking in at approximately 186,282 miles per second. Here on planet Earth, the speed of light is essentially instantaneous, which is to say that anything traveling at the speed of light anywhere on the globe gets to its destination in an instant, in a period of time that is barely perceptible. We're not able to transport any material object anywhere near so fast, of course, but the speed of light is the speed of electricity and the electromagnetic spectrum that we use to send messages to distant locations. Through a series of inventions beginning in the early 19th century that include the telegraph, the telephone, the wireless, radio, television, the satellite, and computer networks, we've created a new environment for ourselves where information moves at the speed of light. It is a new environment for us. And when I say it is an environment, I mean that we ourselves live inside it and are shaped and influenced by it, as much as we are shaped and influenced by various aspects of our natural environment. And living within this electronic media environment, we ourselves move at the speed of light, not in a material sense, of course, not through transportation and travel, but through communication. We not only send messages, but we extend ourselves, our very being, through our technologies, and thereby are stretched instantaneously all across the globe. McLuhan made the point that since the medium is the message, the user becomes the content. We are the content of our media. We are sent over the wires and airwaves as we become electronic avatars and virtual selves. McLuhan and his colleague Edmund Carpenter made the point that under these conditions, we find that we are nowhere and everywhere at the same time, and in this regard, we become like angels. Now, to understand this new form of angelism, it's important to remember that the word angel has the root meaning of messenger. Angels were thought to be messengers from a higher power, and we ourselves become messengers as we are sent over the wires and airwaves. We become the content of the media, but you may recall that I also said that we are a medium, and I want to emphasize this is not a contradiction. I want to reassure you of that, because McLuhan explained that the content of a medium, it can be another medium. For example, speech becomes the content of writing, writing becomes the content of printing, and printing becomes the content of various forms of electronic text. And so it is with the human medium. We become the medium mediated, the medium remediated again and again. And as we're mediated and remediated electronically, we become disembodied, discarnate messengers traveling at the speed of light. This new angelism coincides with what might arguably be called a renaissance of spirituality, one that includes New Age spirituality, also the Western embrace of Eastern religious and philosophical traditions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, as well as some of the martial arts disciplines, as well as the vital spiritual component in various aspects of the traditional Abrahamic religions, including the current fascination with the Jewish Kabbalah and various Christian and Islamic spiritual movements. Now, the sharp decline of traditional religion over the past half-century has in some ways been liberating in the pursuit of pure spirituality, but in other ways it's been associated with a turning away from any form of the sacred. Atheism and secular humanist orientations have not only been on the rise, but have been increasingly more assertive in denying the existence of any spiritual dimension to life. And this is an extremism that's unprecedented in human history. I bring this up simply as a reminder that our current Renaissance, like all such periods of rebirth, does not involve the entire population. Indeed, it only involves a minority, but a minority that can potentially affect cultural change that can eventually spread to the majority. So this is a time of transition, a time in between times, and therefore a time of great turmoil as well as great promise. We stand poised at a bifurcation point, a moment when the flow of events can move in different directions of equal probability. And it's during such times that we have the best opportunity to influence the course of history and shape the future. And so we may discover in cyberspace a new kind of sacred space. We may discover in virtual environments a new form of expanded consciousness. As you may know, Timothy Leary embraced virtual reality in the 90s as the ultimate trip. But I'm not convinced that that's the best way for us to proceed, or that it's the proper culmination of our spiritual renaissance. Instead, I'd like to suggest to you that spirituality at the speed of light has opened the door to a series of 7 shifts in thinking and consciousness that I'd like to identify. And in doing so, I won't be revealing anything new. All of these shifts have been discussed before, but perhaps not in this particular context. And in opening a door to these shifts, I hasten to add, we're not commanded to enter. We are only extended an invitation. We must decide for ourselves whether we are willing and able to step through to the other side. Now, the first shift is from matter to energy. Prior to the 19th century, it was a common sense understanding that the world was made up of matter. It was only natural to think that the stuff of the universe was, well, stuff. It was only after scientists began to experiment with electricity and came to realize that it was not a substance, not a fluid as they first thought, but a form of energy, that they were able to settle on the understanding that the universe itself was essentially composed of energy, that matter was just a very stable form of energy, one that could be converted into other forms of energy, and that's expressed by the famous formula introduced by Albert Einstein, E equals mc squared. That is, energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. This established that the speed of light is the universal constant, the one phenomenon that is not subject to relativity, that does not change no matter where you are, what time it is, or how fast you're moving. So in speaking of spirituality at the speed of light, we are speaking of spirituality that's connected to the universal constant, that's not opposed to, but rather anchored to scientific knowledge. This is essential for any kind of spirituality today. not only to provide an appearance of legitimacy, but for its very validity. I think we all know how individuals who deny the theory of evolution, for example, only ended up making monkeys out of themselves. But what I want to emphasize is how the shift in thinking has affected our approach to spirituality. In non-literate or oral cultures, tribal cultures, spirit was thought to be everywhere, in part of everything in the environment. Everything, animals, trees, rivers, and rocks, was alive and aware in some way, and spirit was part of the same ecosystem as everything else. With literacy, this form of immanence gave way to a concept of transcendence, as the supernatural was displaced, moved from all around us up to a mountaintop, from a mountaintop up to the sky, from the sky up to some otherworldly heaven that resides God knows where. The divine was removed from the earth and concentrated and centered in a transcendent pantheon or supreme being. And modern science removed the divine and the spiritual altogether from our lives. Science deals with life and consciousness as a material phenomenon and sets aside the sacred and the supernatural as outside the scope of its investigations. Spirit cannot be observed or quantified or tested or experimented upon, and therefore cannot be studied by science. Spirit then was banished from scientific consideration and conversation, with the growing suspicion that whatever does not avail itself of empirical examination is simply not real, a product of overactive imaginations, of fiction, and of fantasy. So, to recapture a bit of legitimacy in a world governed by science, to translate the traditional notion of spirit into a modern sensibility, and to restore some actual connection to the scientific worldview, spirit was recast as a form of energy, as spiritual energy and psychic energy. After all, energy is essentially intangible, often invisible, and serves as the driving force behind all forms of motion and animation. In this way of thinking, spiritual energy can be stored like a battery, certain locations like Stonehenge, can be captured by devices such as a dream catcher, transmitted along certain channels such as ley lines, or through humans and artifacts in the form of healing energy. Now, electricity, utilized for the purposes of communication, presented an especially powerful touchstone for new conceptions of spirituality. The telegraph turned written messages into a series of ghostly buzzes and beeps, dematerializing the word, transmitting to a distant location a mysterious message from beyond. The telephone, with its voices at once seemingly out of the blue, supernatural and also unreal, hence phony, served as the model for the concept of the telepath and telepathy. Sinclair Lewis called ESP mental radio. Mental radio. And without a doubt, it was Guglielmo Marconi's wireless telegraph and the subsequent development of radio broadcasting that released the genie from the bottle, letting the ghosts loose from the wires that contained them and allowing them to roam the atmosphere. And giving us voices from the ether, we gained a new way of thinking about spirituality. And so an individual with the ability to dial up or tune in the spirit called a medium. And for those who believe that claims about talking to dead people are nothing more than a hoax, well, that would give new meaning to the idea that the medium is the message. That energy, the point is that energy provides us with an important metaphor for thinking about spirit. I just want to emphasize the need for caution concerning the metaphors that we use. And remember that they are metaphors, to remember that the map is not the territory. Spirit may be likened to energy, and understanding energy can help us to better understand spirit. But energy is still very much a part of the physical, material world, and should not, I would argue, be equated with spirit. The lesson of energy is that there are unseen and unsensed aspects of our world, that there are currents and flows that surround us, that exist outside of our awareness. And that when we focus on matter and the material world, we're correct in sensing that something's missing. We might then imagine a spectrum of existence with matter at one end, energy in the middle as the foundation of the universe, and then spirit at the opposite end of matter, not as energy, but as something else. Well, the shift from matter to energy is related to a second shift from the static to the dynamic. It's a shift in focus from permanence to change, from fixity to flux, from the solid to the fluid. The science of subatomic physics has helped us to understand that what appears to be still and unmoving to us is in fact constantly in motion. It may not be possible for our bodies to be transported at the speed of light, but the subatomic particles that we're composed of are vibrating and oscillating at that speed. So in that sense, we are in fact moving at the universal constant. And with this in mind, spirit is best understood not as an architecture or structure as in classic images of heaven and hell, but like electricity as currents and flows. Along the same lines, in place of earlier beliefs that species are fixed and unchanging, we now understand that evolution is the order of the day. Indeed, everything evolves. Stars and planets, galaxies, the universe itself evolves, our technology evolves, human societies evolve, human consciousness evolves as well. We may imagine our species to be perfect and eternal, but we're just passing through. We're part of a continuing stream of mutation and recombination, a stream that reaches back to the first form of life, and that'll continue to move forward and evolve, providing that we can avoid extinction. Evolution is a pattern that exists and persists across many different phenomena, and would follow that spirituality evolves as our knowledge and understanding increases, and that spirit itself is subject to the process of evolution. Among those who pioneered this view is the French Jesuit mystic Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who spoke of a human evolution towards a higher spiritual existence in the form of the noosphere, a higher form of collective cosmic consciousness. It's worth noting that Teilhard was inspired by electronic media such as radio in coming to this understanding, but what I want to stress is the general notion that we can understand spirit to be dynamic and evolving, a process of evolution that includes us as well. Along with evolution, we've come to understand and think of the world in dynamic terms as an ecology characterized by interdependence. We live in an ecological age, an age of ecologies, not just the ecology of biology, but ecologies of mind and consciousness, ecologies of society and culture, ecologies of communication, information, and symbol, and my own personal favorite, ecologies of media. Can we then think about ecologies of spirituality? Can we think of spirit as existing not in a separate and completely distinct dimension, but as entering into an ecological relationship with the material world? We might then consider how changes to one part of the ecology affect the other part, whether a lack of spirituality is harmful to the material world, and whether damage done to the environment also wounds the spirit of the earth. The Kabbalistic saying, as above, so below, reflects an ecological view along with its counterpart, as below, so above. Obviously, we need to find a balance based on an understanding of the interdependence of the above and the below, of spirit and matter, of the sacred and the profane. And understanding the dynamic nature of reality, we come to the dichotomy between chaos and order. Life requires a dynamic balance between chaos and order. Information uses chaos to create order. Evolution requires a bit of chaos to disrupt order, which forces change that then can result in a new formation of order, possibly one on a higher level of complexity than previously. Chaos gives birth to order, which is to say that order emerges out of chaos spontaneously, and it is on the edge of chaos that we get progress and growth. A frequently evoked metaphor is surfing, which involves coping with a dynamic, fluid environment, riding the wave while on the verge of falling, but somehow avoiding the fall, finding a dynamic equilibrium from one moment to the next, achieving not stasis, but homeostasis. Now, understanding how life emerges spontaneously as systems organize themselves, and how evolution moves towards greater complexity in defiance of entropy, can be taken as a sign of the presence of the sacred in the universe, and can instill in us a new appreciation of spirituality as a natural part of the universal ecosystem. And this has been suggested by the biologist and complexity theorist Stuart Kauffman. Well, the shift from the static to the dynamic coincides with a third shift from a focus on space to an emphasis on time. Space is the more familiar of the two, the more material, the more tangible. We naturally think in spatial terms, and we spatialize time. We conceive of time in terms of space, in the form of calendars where it's laid out, chronologies and timelines, and the clock face. Time is the familiar stranger, said J.T. Fraser, and we use the familiar metaphor of space to help us grasp the strangeness of time. And here too, we must be cautious about taking our metaphors too seriously. Even Einstein, who taught us that space and time are simply different aspects, different dimensions of reality, demonstrated a certain bias towards space in calling the unified field space-time. After all, why not call it time-space? This is exacerbated by physicists who claim that time does not exist, that it's just one dimension out of 10 or more. But why should there only be one dimension of time when space has so many? It's not fair. There are many ways to conceive of time as multidimensional. One example can be taken from the comparative religion scholar Mircea Eliade, who discussed the differences between sacred and profane time. Profane time is our everyday time, which proceeds irreversibly forward. Sacred time exists outside of profane time, but intersects with it on a regular basis. Holidays, holy days, may be marked on the calendar, but when we take part in sacred rituals, we enter a time out of time, what the Australian Aborigines call the dream time, a time that includes the sacred times of every era and that links them all to the moment of creation. Creation of the world, of a people, a society, a sacred institution, a foundational moment. Eliade also discusses notions of sacred space and profane space, but it's not difficult for us to grasp the idea of space existing in different dimensions. When it comes to time, the electronic media provide us with new dimensions of time and perhaps with new forms of sacred time. Certainly, instantaneous communication eradicates distance, eliminating space and leaving us only with time. We also gain the ability to capture time, to catch a moment in a photograph, in an extended period of time in a recording, and we can manipulate that captured time in the form of slow motion and fast motion. And of course, there's a kind of immortality that can be achieved in being preserved in celluloid, on magnetic tape, and in data banks. Of course, there's a difference between simulation and reality, but the point is that our electronic media have opened us up to new forms of time consciousness. And time, I would suggest, is essential for understanding spirituality at the speed of light. But the shift from space to time coincides with a fourth shift, from things to events. Things can appear to be static, but events are, by their very nature, dynamic. Alfred Korzybski was notoriously critical of our tendency to think in terms of things rather than events, in that thinking of the world as made up of things does not take into account the passage of time and the constant presence of change. Thinking in terms of things leads us to objectify the world, rather than seeing ourselves in ecological relationships with our surroundings. Thinking in terms of things leads us into the trap of identity, which Korzybski warned about. And instead, Korzybski followed Einstein in thinking of reality as composed of unique events in space-time. Each of us, everything we encounter, is a happening, Every situation is impermanent and should be treated as transitory and ephemeral. Each one of us is just passing through this life, and we're all riding the Big Bang, an explosion so massive that it is still going on after almost 14 billion years. And so we're moving outward at a rate of something like 1,342,000 miles per hour. If that's not cause enough for a sense of awe and a renewed spirituality, I'm not sure what is. In thinking in terms of events, we can understand spirit as something that happens, not as a thing. It is movement, not stillness, change, not stasis. The shift from things to events brings us to a fifth shift, from nouns to verbs. Benjamin Lee Whorf discussed how Western languages are noun-oriented. We tend to use nouns to describe the world, whereas the Native American languages of the Hopi and Navajo that he studied are verb-oriented. Nations represent different sets of metaphysics, different views of the world. And Whorf noted that a verb-oriented metaphysics not only better reflected our understanding of the universe based on contemporary physics, but it also represented a valuable set of spiritual insights. Thinking in terms of nouns leads us to see the world as composed of things that tend to be static and unchanging. Thinking in terms of verbs leads individuals to think of events and dynamic processes. Our noun orientation has been very useful, in that thinking about the world as objects leads us to think that they can be touched and held and captured and owned, studied and analyzed, mastered and controlled. And so we get modern science and technology. Thinking about the world as verbs leads us to think in terms of flow and flux, surfing the wave and finding balance and harmony, and thinking and relating to the world in ecological terms. Buckminster Fuller described himself with the following words. He wrote, "I live on earth at present and I don't know what I am. I know that I am not a category, I am not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb." Traveling at the speed of light, there are no nouns, there are only verbs. It's a challenge to think of ourselves in that way, to think not about identity, not about who we are, but about what we do, about our actions. Fuller also suggested that God is a verb, and the Kabbalist Rabbi David Cooper elaborated on that idea. God is action, God is creation, God is doing. That's really a challenge for us to think in these terms, because even the word verb is a noun. So is event, process, time, spirit, and all of those gerunds that we're so fond of, like being, becoming, happening. They're all nouns. But traveling at the speed of light, nouns no longer serve us well, and new vocabularies and new grammars are needed. Now, to some extent, the moving image and audiovisual media provide us with some alternatives to language that are, in a sense, verb-oriented. But still, in language, we need to find new ways to think in verbs rather than nouns. That would be of great value for our pursuit of spirituality in our new media environment. Now, the shift from nouns to verbs connects to a sixth important shift from the visual to the acoustic. And speaking of the speed of light, I realize I've invoked a very powerful visual metaphor in that light is associated with the divine, the sanctified, the good, all that stands opposed to the forces of darkness. We may have an instinctive aversion to the dying of the light, but light in the visual sense has a special connection to reading and writing, which after all cannot be done in the dark. Whereas we have no problem speaking and listening even in a pitch-black environment. And so we may speak of spiritual enlightenment, but when you look at the historical period known as the Enlightenment, it was not a time of spiritual renewal, but rather an era marked by the triumph of reason. Along with that, learning and knowledge, which were associated with books, which require the visual sense and quite a bit of quiet as well, resulting in a heightened, overemphasized, monopolizing visual sense. And so we find ourselves alone, looking for the light, burning the midnight oil. and perhaps no medium was no more of a boon to reading than the electric light bulb, which McLuhan considered a medium without content, one that contained pure information. But he also noted that electricity ultimately shifts us back into the acoustic world that we inhabited prior to literacy. Now, in speaking of literacy and visualism, it's not my intention to imply that we somehow made a wrong turn in our historical development. Writing was the most important invention in human history, but the progress that came with it came at a cost. The written word made it possible to preserve and accumulate knowledge, learning, and wisdom, and as such has been instrumental in the process that Korzybski termed time binding. But writing also transformed the word from an event to a thing, and thereby communicated a metaphysics in which the world is made up of objects and not events. Writing fixed knowledge, freezing it on the page, setting it in stone. That helped to keep it from being lost or distorted, but in doing so, we lost the flexibility of oral tradition and the balance that came with it. Writing freed us from the burden of memorization. Before writing, knowledge could only be preserved in collective memory. Writing freed us to reflect, assess, and criticize our traditions, but it eventually resulted in us disparaging the traditional and the time-honored, and instead embracing only the new and the novel. Writing separated the knower from the known, as Eric Havelock put it, making us conscious of ourselves, making it possible for the individual to truly know thyself, for us to know our own minds. But this self-consciousness could also lead to doubt and indecisiveness, to a separation from one's environment, a disconnect with nature and ecology, with community, and with one's own self as it became divided, compartmentalized, perhaps even schizophrenic. Writing made it possible to move past tribalism, to break away from the pressures of the group, and see ourselves as individuals. But in doing so, we lost our sense of responsibility in caring for others. We lost our sense of belonging to something greater than ourselves, and became alienated members of the lonely crowd. It's only with writing that we get isolated mystics and hermits who contemplate the world within themselves and who devote their lives to the study of a sacred text. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey has 3 stages: separation, initiation, and return. Without the return stage, where the hero uses the gifts gained through the previous stage to solve whatever problems the groups are facing, without that final stage of return, the hero's journey is a failure. But for the bookish individuals of literate culture, separation can become an end unto itself. A writing gives us the sacred text, and with it codified law, ethics, and morality, human rights, and human freedom, and these are great gifts indeed. But writing also instilled within us a two-valued orientation, in the sense that either you accept the sacred text or you have rejected it. Either you swear to honor and obey its teachings, or you are an unbeliever. Either you convert, or you are an infidel. Either you agree with the doctrine as written, or you are a heretic or apostate. Either you are a Christian, only a Christian, or you are not a Christian. You cannot be a Christian and not be a Christian at the same time, nor can you be a Christian and a Muslim at the same time. Writing did provide us with new tools for thought, though, and allowed us to think in more abstract terms, to think in terms of transcendence in the place of immanence, in terms of monotheism rather than paganism and animism for the first time, and to think in terms of ideal forms and higher planes of being and abstract qualities such as love, freedom, and justice. But in doing so, it became possible to get lost in our abstractions, to reify abstract concepts, treat them as if they were physical things, to forget to ground ourselves in the human life world. This is the problem that Korzybski sought to address by way of his discipline of general semantics. And up until the 20th century, there was no strict separation between science and spirituality, between empiricism and the occult, but visualism did introduce a wedge that grew larger and larger until today we find ourselves off balance and decentered spiritually. and suspicious of science in certain ways for its single-mindedness and one-dimensionality. So the development of writing and literacy were vital for the evolution of human consciousness, but evolution is an ongoing process, and as travelers at the speed of light, we have the potential to reclaim a balance by restoring the acoustic to its rightful place in our lives. After all, the first writing system was invented only about 5,500 years ago. It's not that long ago. First alphabet only 3,500 years ago, and the printing press only 550 years ago. Whereas speech has been with us for tens of thousands of years, maybe 100,000 years, maybe more. The spoken word is present in all human cultures. We are hardwired, our brains are hardwired with the potential for speech. We pick up spoken language in early childhood without much effort. We don't have to go to school to learn how to speak. When the spoken word was the only major form of human communication, we lived in a world defined by sound, what McLuhan called acoustic space. In the space we perceive by listening, we find ourselves in the center of the world as our sense of hearing picks up what is happening all around us, in all directions at once. All sound is surround sound. Situated at the center of the sphere, circle, we're part of everything around us, connected, a part of the ecology of everything. It's a subjective position, but not necessarily self-centered or egocentric, as it fosters a sense of unity, of us together, not the isolated I of individual identity. Its vision, especially when it's trained to focus on a fixed point of view, as we are when we learn to read, that places us outside of the world as voyeurs and peeping toms on the outside looking in. We're gazing as individuals separated from our world by our alien vision and consequently objectifying the world. That position enables us to take on an objective point of view, distanced and detached. And that's of course associated with science. But objectivism is a perspective that treats everything in the world as objects, including other people. The visual space in which we focus on objects fosters what Martin Buber called the I-it relationship, whereas the acoustic space in which we listen to others moves us to engage the world through I-thou relationships. Visual space gives us the concept of nature. That is, a concept of the environment as something apart from us, outside of ourselves. The environment as a thing and as something to be tamed, controlled, and possessed. Acoustic space suggests an ecological approach. The environment as partner and lover, as other and mother, as Mother Earth, Gaia, an entity alive and conscious that we must negotiate with. And I use the metaphor of harmony, and please note that that's an acoustic metaphor, a rare example of one as well. But keep in mind also that the ear is the organ not only of hearing, but also of balance. Sound is dynamic in a way that sight is not. Vision can give the impression of an unchanging scene. Visual arts depict a static image. Photography captures an instant in time, and the freeze frame freezes a moment out of the moving image. But sound cannot be held or frozen. Pause an audio recording, all you get is silence. Pause a video recording, you get an image, but no sound. Walter Han reminded us that sound only exists as it's going out of existence. Sound only exists in time. Its signals change. A word, as it sounded, is an event. And sound is energy. It is power. Think of the case of the magic spell, right? The spell remains inert as long as it's only written in a book. It only takes effect when it is spoken out loud, when it is recited, when we spell it out. In fact, the very word spell comes from the German word spiel, which means speak. By the same token, prayer is typically spoken or sung or whispered or maybe said silently to oneself, but we don't usually pray by writing God a letter. And that's really the essential point that Ang makes, that sound is fundamental to a sense of the sacred. In the New Testament, when the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the Word," it doesn't mean the written word. He means the spoken word. In the beginning was God's speech act. In Genesis, God begins his act of creation by saying, "Let there be light." And after saying that, only after he says those words, only then does he create the light. Sound comes first. Sound precedes and takes precedence over light and vision. In this, the biblical narrative is consistent with biological development. Think about it. Before we're born, coming to term in the darkness of the womb, we are surrounded by an invisible environment. We're blind. The environment includes the amniotic fluid, a medium that conveys sound quite well. Before we're born, we're comforted by the rhythm of our mother's heartbeat, and we become attuned to the sound of our mother's voice. And in the end, or rather in the beginning, we leave the sacred sphere of acoustic space and are born into the profane visual world. And once born, in fact, it takes some time before we learn how to see. Right? Newborn babies can't see, even though their eyes are open. And in Genesis, it actually indicates that God doesn't see until 2 days after he creates the light. At least, it was not until the end of the third day that we find that famous formula, "and God saw that it was good." The light not only lets him eventually see what he's doing, but lets him reflect upon and evaluate his creation. But in the Hebrew Holy Scriptures, God cannot be seen, but his voice can be heard. It can be thunderous, like the sound of the ram's horns that bring down the walls of Jericho, or it can be the still small voice heard by the prophet Elijah. The voice of the divine brings inspiration, and it is the source of truth. In ancient Greek tradition, the epic poet Homer is blind, which means that he's well equipped to hear the truth as it's spoken to him by the muses. The Roman goddess of justice is also blind, the better to hear the truth in listening to testimony, holding a hearing, an audience, maybe even an audit, which is listening to accounts. Vision is secondary and expendable. According to the New Testament, you have the Gospel of Matthew advising us, "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out." And it counsels, "If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off." No recommendations are made about offensive ears, however. We can only wonder what Matthew might have made of someone like Vincent van Gogh. As a painter, Van Gogh relied on eye and hand, but his extreme visualism rendered the ear a distraction. Actually, Matthew does relate that after Jesus is betrayed, one of his followers attacked a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. But it doesn't seem to be the ear that offended the follower, let alone the servant. And in fact, this amputation prompts Jesus to make his famous admonition that those who live by the sword die by the sword, which of course is another way of saying the medium is the message. But to return to the basic point, vision separates and alienates us and turns us into private individuals. When we read, even if we read the exact same text at the exact same time, each one of us reads by ourselves. But when we listen as a group, all together at once, as a community. We commune with sound, with voice, with music, and with the sounds of nature. The Hebrew word for spirit is ruach, and that also means wind. In the story of creation, the Spirit of God is a wind upon the waters, and God blows the breath of life into Adam. Wind, breath, speech, sound. As we moved from orality to literacy, we moved from that acoustic space to visual space and lost touch with a sense of spirit that surrounds and envelops us. But McLuhan made the point that now as we're moving from literacy to electricity, we find ourselves back in acoustic space, or rather a new kind of acoustic space. Wherever we go, we're at the center again, the center of electronic transmissions, of waves and currents. We become easily immersed in their signals, pulled in by the television programming, absorbed in telephone conversations, immersed in online environments. The problem is that there's a great deal of cacophony in this new acoustic space. The signal-to-noise ratio is very poor, and we need to quiet our environment down to regain a sense of spirituality. You know, silence is not the absence of sound, it's the absence of noise, an extraneous and artificial sound, making room for the harmonies and polyphony of the natural world, the still small voice within, and the music of the sacred to wash over us. Traveling at the speed of light, we are given the opportunity to enter into acoustic space and return into an ecological mode of existence, one of balance and harmony. And as we move from literacy to communications based on electricity, the too valued either-or orientation of literate culture is weakened. Today, we suddenly find you can be both and. You can be both a Buddhist and a Jew, both a Christian and a Baha'i. You can mix and match, choosing from a variety of different religious and spiritual approaches. New Age spirituality is notoriously eclectic. And as we move away from single-minded reverence for a single sacred text that's said to contain all of the answers, we're free to ask the questions anew, free to seek the answers anew, to seek new answers. Our renaissance of spirituality is based, or can only be based, on the freedom to enter into dialogue, to open discussion, and to ask questions freely of one another, and to ask questions of our world. We retrieve, in a way, the pre-literate encounter with the sacred. The anthropologist Jack Goody describes spirituality in oral cultures as open-ended in a meaningful way, encouraging the search, the quest, the journey after the truth. But we return now to the community, having undergone the initiation rites of literacy, having gone through the trials and earned the gifts of heightened consciousness, of criticism and analysis, of logic and abstract thinking. With these gifts, we're now freed to become seekers once more, but this time with a better understanding of what we're searching for, and a better understanding of where we're searching, with better maps to guide us through that territory, better able to arrive at a new synthesis of life, the universe, and everything. Now, the shift from visual to acoustic brings us to our seventh and final shift, from the absolute to the relative. Isaac Newton developed his physics based on the existence of absolute time and space that existed outside the universe, as if the universe were contained in some kind of box. Einstein said, there is no box, it's just us. There's only the stuff of the universe. There's no absolute point to stand on, no outside looking in. You can only measure distance and duration in one point relative to another point. And what many forget is that relativity doesn't mean that everything is relative and nothing is certain. Relativity means that the only thing that we can count on, aside from the speed of light, is relationship. Relationships are not relative. As we're traveling at the speed of light and living in a relativistic universe, that's something we need to keep in mind. For example, every culture and every belief system is not equally valid. We know enough to say that a culture that does not value human life is wrong. A system that sacrifices children is wrong. We don't have to embrace absolutes and say there's only one right way to live, but we can identify error and evil, and those things that deaden the spirit and violate all that is sacred. And in this, we must have the courage to recognize right from wrong and to speak out and to take action. What counts is relationship. Our relationships with our world, with the sacred dimensions of life, and with others. If we cannot see the face of God, of the divine, of the sacred, in the face of every human being, then we cannot make any progress ethically, morally, and spiritually. And if we cannot see the face of God, of the divine, of the sacred, in our environment, our world, our amazing, incredible universe, then we are truly spiritually lost. As travelers at the speed of light, we've been given the opportunity to develop new approaches to spirituality, approaches based on energy rather than matter, the dynamic rather than the static, time rather than space, events rather than things, verbs rather than nouns, the acoustic rather than the visual, and relations rather than absolutes. The door is open, but it is up to us, to all of us as a community, as one humanity, to step through the door and discover what is waiting for us on the other side.
Powerful stuff.
Are you going to have questions?
It's your...
We'll take
Will you entertain some questions?
Lance will take questions, comments, whatever you
I'll
wish.
try to entertain you.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
That was brilliant, really brilliant.
Yes.
Would you stand up and talk loudly to us all?
I said it was brilliant. He gave a fantastic perspective to the things I think everyone in this room certainly is interested in. But also, I'm anxious to read the book, because I assume that these are thoughts that are incorporated in the book. Am I correct, Lance?
I mean, it's in the book, but not framed in this way. I mean, the book doesn't address the topic of spirituality.
This is maybe the new book.
Maybe. I mean, the book is kind of centered around general semantics and media ecology as well. But I mean, it does get into questions related to consciousness and you know, our understanding of the world. And there is a little bit, there's a piece on about the Ten Commandments in there. So I mean, it does touch on it, but it doesn't focus on this particular
Well, this is a brilliant
topic.
concept that you presented tonight. I wish you were in the book. If not, you'll have to write another book.
Well, that's the thing. And that's why, I mean, I appreciate being invited here. I guess Alan assigned me this topic. In the book, there's it's the final chapter is the future of consciousness, which Alan also assigned me many years ago. But you know, I appreciate that because it gives me an opportunity to speak to these topics. Yes.
Professor, some people are more inclined to learn by reading,
Yes.
and other people are more inclined to learn by listening. So what is your observation of other differences between those types of people?
Well, I'm not sure that there's the differences are as significant between those types of people as they are between whole populations where people are reading or aren't reading. So that even the people who prefer speaking, you know, having learned to read, some of the latest research really bears out some of the things McLuhan sort of intuitively understood going back to the 60s. You know, recent research on the brain structure really has shown to be true. That is, you know, for example, and we learn to read, we rewire the brain, and it actually reduces. And I think this is true. The more of a reader you are, it takes part of the wiring that's devoted to vision and shifts it into this reading mode, so that they find that people who don't read, I mean, they think they were probably, that part of the brain was probably the part that was used for, say, picking out things in the environment. What they find is that with the more literate you are, the harder, as a generalization, the worse you are at facial recognition. Right? It's like there's only so much, you know, in the neural structure, and either it gets purposed here or it gets purposed there. So, and I do think, you know, the people who prefer to talk, you know, the bookish people, right, we get lost. We get, you know, we don't look at other people as we're looking at the page. People who like to talk also like to look other people in the eyes and engage with other people as persons. And I mean, this makes reading sound kind of awful, but the point is obviously that we need a balance between the two. I mean, it's really when we have both of them, and they're we can avail ourselves of both arsenals that we really can move ahead. And now we need to go beyond that balance and bring something new into play.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me get back there.
Yes, well, when you were speaking about shifts, you were speaking about the fifth shift from a noun to verb, and I was interested in your first comment about death, and I had this odd experience of seeing my father's spirit leave his body when he died, and I can see, it was just sort of a funnel, a little gray funnel of energy leaving his crown chakra. And I said to the nurse, "Oh my, he's dying." And she pushed me away, and yes, he had died. But I didn't see in the sixth shift, you mentioned visual to acoustic, so I could see the funnel of energy leaving, but I didn't hear anything. So I'm thinking, well, maybe it was a frequency past my capability of hearing. It just sort of vaporized and was gone. But just, basically, I guess the shifts could be at a frequency or a condition that we aren't attuned to. Whatever level of shift we're having or we're experiencing.
In saying this, I didn't mean that we need to cut out the visual, or that
well,
it doesn't.
Poignant experience.
No, but I'm just saying, that the visual certainly is an important part of our array of senses, and it was more the point. What I was trying to get at was when we rely only on the visual, and again, that was something that really came into being in the modern era, and largely associated with printing, where we kind of focus on, we need silence, right? Get rid of all sound and just focus on the visual against all other senses. So there's no problem. I mean, you might even say, that is even a particular kind of visualism when we talk about, as I mentioned, the fixed point of view, which is the focused vision. When you unfocus your vision, people in non-literate societies don't use that kind of vision, right? So there's more use of peripheral vision, more of a scanning of the environment, again, a kind of dynamic use of vision, rather than, it's like staring. We're taught as kids, don't stare, right? And that's, it's the staring kind of vision. It's also the vision that we use to target things. You look through sights and, shoot at things. So that's the particular kind of vision that becomes to monopolize our sensory balance. And so I don't see any concern or any problem with what you're talking about, because if it is indeed possible to see phenomena such as you're talking about, it probably comes about not when you're using that particular fixed point of view, but when your eyesight is working in a different way. When I was in college, I read those Carlos Castaneda books that went into that stuff, and there's some people believe that that's a hoax, that he made it all up, but if he, well, it may be, but if he did by drawing on actual, real ideas and actual traditions. He was an anthropologist, after all. And one of them was actually to kind of like relax your eyes and not focus, let the focus go. And in that way, you restore more of a sensory balance. But the other thing I would just say to this is that I would go back to the association of breath with life. That sound, the written word is dead. Now, the advantage is that it can go on communicating after the author is gone. Right? The spoken word is alive, and it comes from the breath of life. So, in that sense, sound has a very strong connection. Again, it's a connection: breath, wind, sound, speech. Yes, sir.
If I understand you correctly, then are you saying that the auditory mode is more fundamental to our being than the visual mode?
Would you stand up? I'm having trouble hearing you.
She's asking you to stand up because she can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Are you saying that the auditory mode is more fundamental to our being than the visual mode?
Yes.
In a word.
Well, it's very curious about that, though. That audio books are a very tiny part of the book market that people seem to, although I prefer personally audio books, but editors point out to me over and over again that it's a very tiny part of the book market that most people prefer to read rather than to listen.
Okay.
And do you have any comments about that?
Sure. Audiobooks take a work that was created for the express purpose of reading and turn it into something else. So it's the wrong comparison. Compare the market of audiobook, or compare the book market to the market for music, because that's what we listen to. And I think you'll find that in that case, it's another story. But you're always going to lose out when you take any kind of item that was created in one medium and you just try to port it over to another medium. You're going to lose something. For example, whenever anyone watches this on video, it's going to lose a lot of what exists right here and now in reality. And it's nice to have the video, but the straightforward recording of a lecture always looks a lot less interesting than it is in reality. You can't. That's really what we're talking about here. Yes.
When we speak or when we hear music.
Can you speak up, please?
When we speak and listen, when we hear music, there are physical vibrations. Physical vibrations now going from me to the speaker and from you to all of us. So we're being touched in a way that doesn't happen when we see it. I understand vision. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, sure. I mean, that's absolutely the case. And again, it goes to the intimacy of sound. Vision and sound and smell are kind of the distance receptors. But I think of the three, in a sense, sound has a certain intimacy to it, and certainly at a certain volume we feel it as well. I mean, it's one of the attractions. It's one of the reasons why I don't hear so well now, because I played too much loud music in the past, and it was one of the attractions was as you said, the vibes, man. Feeling it on your body. By the way, another attraction of loud music, though. Tony Schwartz, who was an associate of McLuhan's, wrote about this, is that, and if you ever listen to loud music, and as you turn it up, there is definitely a cutoff point. There's like one point where it's different, and then you turn it up just a touch and it changes. And he said that what's going on is, we have, acoustic space, and it's why if you ever close your eyes and try to see if you would walk into a wall, you're able to stop before you hit the wall, because we hear the sound bouncing off. We get a sense of space through acoustics, even though we normally think of space in visual terms. Now, as the volume gets up to a certain point, it's bouncing so fast off of the walls that you no longer get that sense of a confined space. And so, as what Schwartz explained was that it reaches a point where you feel like you're on an infinite plane extending outward in all directions. That is the sensation of loud music, because you can no longer sense any objects, any confinement around you. Yeah.
My name is Diana, and I would like to make a comment concerning the remarks that you made. And I feel that you saw the essence of your father, because we know from science that that there is no, it's an illusionary world that we see, and we don't see with our eyes, but we perceive energy, and our mind translates that energy into pictures. And the true essence of everyone here in this room is energy. And we could communicate totally compatibly without hearing and without seeing, just by exchanging energies.
I'm told we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed what you said and helped me understand more of the fluid. Just two things. You said with the electric light, there's a difference between content and information. And then also a question about, that's part one. And then spirituality. Everyone seems to know what spirituality is within the age that they're living, but each medium presents a new level of spirituality, like the telegraph created spiritualism and television created kind of 60s thing. So as we move into new unexplored mediums, Twitter and beyond the internet, spirituality will change as well. So any ideas where that's going? But first let me hear what the difference between content and information is.
Well, that's sort of an interesting question. Information would only be part of content. Actually, when I started out by saying that I wanted to talk about spirituality as something that's missing, not as something that we have, I must confess that I borrowed that from information theory, because as Claude Shannon in the 40s defined information, it was what we don't have and what we need to resolve uncertainty. In that sense, I mean, you might compare information and data, right? Data is all the content, right? Information is only that data that's meaningful to us, that resolves some uncertainty, that presents us with something new.
What about evolving spirituality in media, like Twitter, those things? How do you see that evolving or spiritual?
Well, I think one of the really important thing that we're seeing today is the incredible interconnection between people. And this is something that has started, again with other electronic media, but it's really coming into full form with all of the kind of media connected to the computer. I mean, the potential is there with electronics. Say, when Marconi does the wireless, and people start to just communicate to each other in the ether like a big network. But that was limited. Now it seems almost unlimited. So that notion of a kind of collective consciousness becomes more and more sustainable. I'm sorry?
Manifested.
Yes, well, it manifests and it becomes sustainable through these media. So I think, in a sense, the structure or the relationship for us to think about in these times is that of the network, the decentralized network, and people being connected in this way, not hierarchical, with someone telling you what to do, but just everyone connected, some more distantly, but everyone was somehow connected to each other throughout the globe. That's where we are, where we're moving into, and that's the thing to think about.
Well, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Lance's book is available right there in the corner there.
How much is the book?
Here, $20 for the book.
Oh, okay, thank you.